the slave soldiers, who defeated the Mongols and ruled Egypt for more than 250 years. In the year 833, in the palace complex of Samarra, on the east bank of the Tigris River in what is now central Iraq, the Abbasid Caliph al-Mu'tasim made a decision that would shape the military history of the Islamic world for the next 1,000 years. He was done relying on Arab soldiers. Arab troops had family ties, tribal allegiances, factional loyalties, and political ambitions that made them unreliable instruments of absolute power. He needed something different. He needed men who owed everything to him and to no one else. His solution was to buy them. Al-Mu'tasim began purchasing Turkic boys from the steppes north of the Black Sea, teenagers captured in raids or sold by impoverished families in the Central Asian grasslands. These boys arrived knowing no one, speaking no Arabic, connected to nothing in the Islamic world except the man who had purchased them. They were converted to Islam, given new names, taught to read and write in Arabic, and then subjected to approximately 7 years of the most intensive military training the medieval world had ever organized. The Arabic word for a purchased military slave was Mamluk, meaning simply one who is owned. The system that al-Mu'tasim created spread across the Islamic world over the following 4 centuries. Sultans discovered that Mamluk soldiers were simultaneously the most loyal and potentially the most dangerous troops imaginable. Loyal because they owed their entire existence, their freedom, their rank, their weapons, their identity, to the patron who had purchased and trained them. Dangerous because a man who had been taught since childhood that his military ability was his only source of worth would eventually look at the ruler above him and calculate whether he could do better. How do you build an army of men who can defeat anyone in the world, and then prevent that army from eventually turning on you? In the case of the Mamluks, the answer to the second question was, you cannot. But what they built before taking power was remarkable enough to outlast the question. Slaves train 7 years to become unstoppable warriors. At the slave markets of Cairo, Aleppo, and Constantinople, the boys who would become Mamluks arrived in groups, thin, frightened, far from home, speaking languages no one around them understood. They had come from the Kipchak Turk territories north of the Black Sea, from the Caucasus Mountains, from the borderlands of what are now Russia, Georgia, and Circassia. They were typically between 10 and 15 years old. Within days of their arrival, the process that would transform them began. The first stage was religious. They were converted to Islam, taught the basics of prayer and Quranic recitation, given Arabic names, and enrolled in classes in Islamic law, fiqh, taught by religious scholars attached to the barracks. This was not simply spiritual indoctrination. It gave the boys a new identity that superseded their ethnic origin and bound them to the broader Mamluk community through shared faith. The second stage was military, and it was called Furusiya, a term that encompassed the entire art of cavalry warfare, approximately equivalent to the European Knight's Code of Chivalry, but more technically focused and more rigorously tested. Furusiya training began with wooden horses. Recruits practiced mounting, dismounting, balance, and stability on carved wooden models before being allowed near a living animal. Once on horseback, they learned to ride with and without a saddle, to control the horse with their knees alone, while both hands held weapons, to turn at speed, to charge and wheel and retreat in coordinated formation. Archery came next, not stationary archery, but mounted archery at full gallop, firing backward over the horse's haunches at moving targets in the technique that the Mongols had perfected and the Mamluks mastered equally. Then lance work, swordsmanship, the throwing axe, and hand-to-hand combat. Training lasted approximately 7 years. When it ended, the graduate was manumitted, legally freed, and given a horse, weapons, and a position in the Sultan's household. He was no longer a slave. He was a Mamluk warrior, and he was among the most dangerous cavalry soldiers alive. And before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support, and let's continue. Slave soldiers decide they no longer need masters. By the year 1249, the Ayyubid Sultanate that Saladin had founded in Egypt in 1174 had fragmented into something closer to a collection of competing principalities than a unified state. The Sultan of Egypt, Al-Salih Ayyub, had responded to this weakness by placing almost total military reliance on his personal Mamluk regiment, the Bahriya, so named because their barracks occupied an island in the Nile. Bahri means of the river. They were predominantly Kipchak Turks, and they numbered in the thousands. The Sultan trusted them above all other soldiers. He had no other choice. When Al-Salih Ayyub died in November of 1249, while the Seventh Crusade of the French king Louis IX was actively invading the Egyptian Nile Delta, his widow Shajar al-Dur concealed the news of his death for weeks to prevent panic. She coordinated the military response herself, while summoning the heir, Turanshah, from distant Hasankeyf. The Mamluks held the line. At the Battle of Mansoura in February of 1250, with Turanshah still not yet arrived, the Mamluk general Baibars led the defense of the city against a crusader vanguard that had entered the streets believing itself victorious. The Mamluks waited, then closed every exit and turned the streets of Mansoura into a killing ground. The Crusaders lost their vanguard entirely. Robert of Artois, the brother of King Louis, was killed there, along with most of the Knights Templar who accompanied him. Only 5 Templar knights escaped alive. Louis IX was captured in April of 1250 during his army's retreat. His ransom was set at an enormous sum. While negotiations proceeded, Turanshah arrived and immediately began replacing Bahriya officers with his own personal slaves, threatening the network that had just saved the Sultanate. In May of 1250, the Bahriya Mamluks assassinated Turanshah. Baibars was among the conspirators. The last Ayyubid Sultan died at a place called Fariskur on the Nile, and Egypt's rulers from that day forward were the men they had hired to protect them. A king of France marches into an ambush. In February of 1250, in the narrow streets of the Egyptian Nile, Delta city of Mansoura, a name that means the victorious in Arabic, the military intelligence of a young Mamluk general named Baibars produced the worst single defeat the Seventh Crusade would suffer. What followed revealed something about the Mamluk military system that its enemies consistently underestimated. These were not simply fierce individual fighters. They were disciplined tacticians who could coordinate complex operations under pressure, communicate through chaos, and exploit the exact moment when an overconfident enemy had extended itself beyond recovery. Robert of Artois, the younger brother of King Louis IX of France, had been given command of the Crusader vanguard. The Crusaders had found an Egyptian informant who revealed a shallow ford across the canal, separating them from the Muslim camp. On the night of February 7th into the 8th, the vanguard crossed in darkness and surprised the Egyptian camp at dawn, killing its commander in the initial assault. Robert was told to hold his position and wait for the main Crusader army to cross and consolidate. He did not hold his position. He charged forward into the city of Mansoura itself, believing he was pursuing a broken enemy. Baibars had positioned his Mamluks inside the city specifically for this moment. The Crusaders entered narrow streets where their cavalry formation could not function and where the exits could be blocked. The Mamluks closed around them from every direction simultaneously. Robert of Artois died there. So did the Earl of Salisbury, William Longespy the Younger. So did nearly every Knight Templar in the vanguard. What had looked like a breakthrough turned out to be a sealed trap. Louis IX spent weeks after Mansoura trying to hold his position before finally ordering retreat in April. His army, decimated by disease and starvation, was captured at Fariscourt. The King of France sat in an Egyptian cell while his captors, the slave soldiers who had just saved Egypt from him, decided that they no longer needed the dynasty they served. The Mongols reach Egypt and find something unexpected. In February of 1258, the forces of Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, commanding the western arm of the Mongol Empire, completed the sack of Baghdad. The city had been the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate for 5 centuries, the intellectual center of the Islamic world, the home of libraries that contained the accumulated scholarship of Greek philosophy, Persian science, and Islamic theology. The last Abbasid Caliph, Al-Mustasim, was wrapped in carpets and trampled to death by horses. Mongol tradition held that the blood of royalty should not touch the earth. Estimates of the dead in Baghdad range from 200,000 to 800,000. The river Tigris reportedly ran black with ink from books thrown into the water. In March of 1260, Damascus fell without significant resistance. The Mongol general Kitbuka, a Nestorian Christian who reportedly celebrated in Damascus's churches after the conquest, pushed south through Palestine. Aleppo had already fallen, Nablus fell, Gaza fell. The Mongols stood at the edge of Egypt, the last substantial Muslim power remaining in the region. Hulagu sent his standard envoy to the Mamluk Sultan Qutuz in Cairo with a letter demanding complete and unconditional surrender. Qutuz had the envoys executed and displayed their heads at the Bab Zuwayla Gate of Cairo. It was either an act of extraordinary defiance or calculated military theater, probably both. What Qutuz also knew, and what the Mongols did not yet fully understand, was that the military crisis had just shifted in the Mamluks' favor. Hulagu's brother Monka Khan had died in battle in distant China in August of 1259. Under Mongol tradition, Hulagu was required to return to Mongolia for the succession assembly, and he took the bulk of his army with him. Kitbuka was left with somewhere between 10,000 and 12,000 soldiers, the same number the Mamluks could field. One battle at a spring saves the Islamic world. On the morning of September 3rd, 1260, in the Jezreel Valley of what is now northern Israel, near a spring called Ain Jalut, Goliath Spring, named in Arabic tradition as the site where the biblical David killed the Philistine warrior, the Mamluk army of Egypt and the Mongol force under Kitbuka met in the battle that historians would later describe as the turning point of medieval Islamic civilization. What happened in those hours determined whether the Mongol Empire would continue west into Africa, whether Mecca and Medina would come under the same empire that had destroyed Baghdad, and whether Islam would survive as a political and cultural force in the Middle East. The Mamluks marched north from Egypt on July 26, 1260. They were permitted by the Crusader kingdoms of the coast, still clinging to a few cities, including Acre, to resupply and camp outside the city walls. The irony was not lost on contemporaries. Muslim soldiers resting as guests of Christian cities while preparing to face the army that had just destroyed the Muslim world. At Ain Jalut, the Mamluk general Baybars commanded the vanguard. He used the Mongols' most famous tactic against them, the feigned retreat. Baybars engaged Kitbuka's forces with enough aggression to appear genuinely engaged, then withdrew, drawing the Mongols forward in pursuit into the broken terrain where the main Mamluk force waited in the surrounding hills. When the Mongol army entered the valley in full pursuit, the ambush closed from every direction. At a critical moment when the Mamluk left flank was breaking under Mongol pressure, Sultan Qutuz ripped off his helmet so his men could see his face, shouted, "My Islam! My Islam!" 3 times, and led his reserve cavalry personally into the gap. Kitbuka was killed on the field. His army was destroyed. The Mongols returned to Syria and Egypt several more times over the following decades. They were never able to threaten Egypt again. Qutuz was assassinated on the return journey to Cairo. The primary suspect was Baybars. A slave who became sultan destroys the Crusaders. In the autumn of 1260, the man who had probably just orchestrated the murder of the sultan, who defeated the Mongols, rode into Cairo and declared himself the 4th sultan of the Mamluk Sultanate. His name was Baybars. Born somewhere in the Kipchak Turk territories north of the Black Sea around 1223, sold into slavery as a teenager after the Mongol invasion of his homeland, purchased ultimately by the Ayyubid Sultan Al-Salih Ayyub, trained as a cavalry soldier, and transformed by the Furusiya system into one of the most capable military commanders the medieval Islamic world produced. He was described in contemporary sources as tall, physically powerful, dark-skinned, and striking for his blue eyes, rare among Turkic peoples. His heraldic blazon was a panther. He placed it on coins, on buildings, and on the bridge he constructed near the city of Lod in Palestine. Baybars understood immediately that the Mamluk state faced 2 permanent threats: the Mongol Ilkhanate of Persia to the northeast, and the surviving Crusader cities along the Palestinian and Lebanese coast. He spent the first years of his reign rebuilding the army, from 10,000 cavalry to 40,000 with a 4,000-man royal guard. He established a postal relay system linking Cairo to Damascus that could carry a message between the 2 cities in 4 days, making it the most efficient communication network in the Islamic world. He rebuilt Syrian fortresses the Mongols had destroyed. He installed a surviving Abbasid prince as ceremonial caliph in Cairo, giving the Mamluk Sultanate the religious legitimacy it needed to present itself as the protector of Islam. Then he turned his attention to the Crusaders. Beginning in 1265, he launched annual campaigns that systematically reduced the Frankish presence in the Levant city, fortress by fortress. Caesarea fell, Haifa fell, Arsuf fell, Safed fell. In 1268, he took Antioch, one of Christianity's most important cities in the East, in Christian hands since the First Crusade of 1098, after a siege of 4 days. He died in Damascus in 1277, reportedly poisoned by a cup of fermented mare's milk he had prepared for an enemy and accidentally drank himself. He was approximately 54 years old. The last Christian city falls after 2 centuries. In the spring of 1291, the Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil assembled the largest army the Mamluk Sultanate had ever fielded and marched it north toward the Mediterranean coast of Palestine. His objective was the city of Acre, the last major Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land, a fortified port city of approximately 40,000 people built on a peninsula with the sea protecting its western and southern sides and massive double walls with 12 towers protecting the landward approaches from the north and east. Acre had been in Christian hands since the Third Crusade, when Richard I of England retook it in 1191. It had been the capital of what remained of the Latin East for a century. The pretext for the siege was an attack by a group of Italian crusaders on Muslim merchants in the city's market. When the Latin authorities refused to surrender the perpetrators, al-Ashraf Khalil declared the siege. What followed was the largest coordinated military operation the Mamluks had ever mounted. Catapults, siege towers, undermining of the walls, blockade of the harbor. The military orders, the Knights Hospitaller, the Knights Templar, and the Teutonic Knights organized the defense with their characteristic discipline, but the defenders were hopelessly outnumbered. They held for 7 weeks. On May 18th, 1291, the final Mamluk assault began simultaneously from multiple directions. The walls were breached. The fighting moved into the streets. The military commander of the Knights Hospitaller, Brother Matthew of Claremont, led a counterattack through the St. Anthony Gate that contemporary chroniclers described as extraordinary personal courage, cutting through the Mamluk ranks until he was overwhelmed by numbers. The last defenders retreated to the harbor. Some escaped by ship. Acre was demolished to deny any future Crusader fleet a base for reestablishment. Within weeks, the remaining Crusader cities of Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, and Haifa surrendered without resistance. 200 years of European Christian presence in the Levant were over. Cairo becomes the greatest city in the Islamic world. In the decades that followed the defeat of the Mongols and the expulsion of the Crusaders, the Mamluk Sultanate entered a period of stability and cultural production that made Cairo the undisputed center of Sunni Islamic civilization. The city had benefited from the catastrophic destruction of Baghdad in 1258. Scholars, craftsmen, artists, and administrators who survived the Mongol sack of Iraq's intellectual capital had fled west, and many ended up in Cairo, bringing their manuscripts, their skills, and their students with them. The Mamluks, who had presented themselves as the defenders of Islam since the moment of Ain Jalut, were enthusiastic patrons of what the Islamic world's foremost minds could produce. The architectural legacy of the Mamluk period remains visible in Cairo today. The Mosque Madrasa of Sultan Hassan, begun in 1356, is considered among the greatest examples of Islamic architecture ever constructed. Its proportions, its carved stone muqarnas vaulting, and its integration of religious school and place of worship in a single monumental structure attracted visitors and scholars from across the Muslim world. The Qalawun complex, completed in 1285, contained the first hospital in Egypt specifically designed to serve any patient, regardless of religion, gender, or social class, alongside a religious school and the Sultan's mausoleum. Mamluk metalwork, decorated brass basins, candlesticks, lamps, and ewers covered with intricate calligraphy and figurative scenes of hunters, musicians, and warriors, set the standard for craftsmanship in the Islamic Mediterranean. The Mamluks also managed the annual Hajj pilgrimage caravans from Cairo and Damascus to Mecca and Medina, providing armed escorts and provisions for hundreds of thousands of pilgrims each year, and their sultans personally financed the decoration of Islam's holiest sites. A 4-day postal service between Cairo and Damascus operated continuously. Trading relationships extended to the Italian maritime city-states, the Spanish Kingdom of Aragon, the Golden Horde in Russia, and trading partners in the Indian Ocean. For nearly a century after Ain Jalut, Cairo was the most important city in the Islamic world and one of the most important cities on earth. Cannon's end. What swords and arrows never could. In the summer of 1516, after more than 2.5 centuries of Mamluk dominance in the eastern Mediterranean, the Ottoman Sultan Selim I assembled an army of at least 60,000 men in Anatolia and marched south toward Syria. The Mamluk Sultan Kansu al-Gawri mobilized approximately 20,000 of his finest cavalry and marched north to meet them. The two armies met on August 24th, 1516, on a wide plain north of Aleppo called Marj Dabik, the Field of Dabik. What happened in the hours that followed was not primarily a test of individual courage, tactical intelligence, or cavalry skill. The Mamluks had all three in abundance. What they lacked, and what the Ottomans possessed in overwhelming quantities, was gunpowder artillery and matchlock infantry. The Ottomans deployed massed cannon fire against the Mamluk cavalry formations before they could close to hand-to-hand range. The Mamluk commander Khair Bak, who had been a secret Ottoman agent, defected to Selim's side during the battle itself. Sultan Kansu al-Ghawri died in the fighting. Of a stroke, or killed in the chaos, accounts differ. The battle lasted a matter of hours. Syria fell to the Ottomans in a single afternoon. On January 22, 1517, the new Mamluk Sultan, Tuman Bey II, tried to defend Cairo at a place called Ridania, with earthworks, fortifications, and a desperate attempt to acquire cannons of his own. The Ottomans flanked his position with Janissary infantry armed with arquebuses and destroyed his army. Cairo fell. Tuman Bey was captured and hanged at the Bab Zuwayla Gate of Cairo, the same gate where Qutuz had displayed the heads of the Mongol envoys 257 years earlier. The system that had taken a 13-year-old Turkic boy from the steppes turned him into the most lethal cavalry soldier alive and eventually placed him on the throne of Egypt, had met the one enemy it could not defeat. Not the Mongols, not the Crusaders, a technology that made horsemanship irrelevant. 267 years after their first sultan, the age of the Mamluks was over.